The autumn of 1964 settled over eastern Kanaki with a gray stillness that seemed to cling to the ridgelines like a held breath. And I remember standing at the crest above Hell Gap, thinking the evening light looked too gentle for the assignment we had been given, though the unease in my chest made it feel otherwise. I was a young sergeant then, the one responsible for pace and map notes, and the moment my boots left the back of the truck, a faint vibration brushed the air, thin as a tuned wire, steady as a pulse. Someone tried to hide beneath the wind. I told myself it was distant power running through lines on some forgotten pole, even though I knew there weren't any out here. And as we scanned the valley, the place looked peaceful in that dying light. A small curve of roofs along a creek, a smear of chimney smoke rising from somewhere the briefing insisted was empty, and one porch lamp glowing through the trees like an eye that refused to blink. Our orders were deliberately thin. Our structural weak points: confirm absence of civilians, prepare the terrain for long-term closure. No mission name, no clear justification, just a quiet command to move in and not be seen. I had done classified work before, but even then, something about walking into a secluded valley the government intended to seal off from its own citizens felt wrong. Before I stepped onto the slope, the question formed in the back of my mind with a weight that would follow me long beyond that week. What exactly needed sealing in a place the map barely acknowledged? At Fort Knox, our days usually swung between dull training routes and forgettable reconnaissance drills. Nothing unusual until that early October morning when a major I barely recognized strode into our tent carrying an unmarked folder. He did not speak to us directly. He handed the file to our captain, stood aside, and waited with a stiffness that made even the routine silence feel strained. The captain scanned the first page without saying a word, then flipped to the second, then back again, long after he should have finished. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of hesitation I had never heard from him. We would travel light, move before dawn, leave no gear behind, not even the smallest item that could be mistaken for evidence. That last instruction bothered all of us. Recon units were cautious, yes, but this was different. More like we were expected to vanish through the terrain without leaving a hint we had ever touched it. The civilian joined us that afternoon, a narrow-shouldered older man, carrying a plain case. No patches on his jacket, no rank, no introduction. He merely said he would observe, report directly to higher command, and accompany us the entire mission. Nobody liked that. Civilians didn't shadow field teams unless something high above our pay grade was involved. We pretended not to watch him, but every one of us kept one eye on the man anyway. At first light the next morning, 2 unmarked transports took us off the main post and down back roads toward the southeast. After hours of winding through forested valleys, we made a stop at a National Guard armory, where guardsmen moved crates to the trucks with the speed that suggested they weren't thrilled to be near their contents. We cracked one open expecting survey equipment. Instead, we found heavy-gauge wire coils, thick enough for perimeter fencing, enough deck cord to cut a hillside in half, and stacks of metal warning signs wrapped in brown paper. Federal property, no entry, all new, all crisp, all meant to last decades. I caught the captain staring at those signs a long moment before he ordered us to load them up. As we pushed deeper into the hills, the land rose sharper, the trees tightened, and the clouds drifted low enough to scrape the tops of the ridges. The civilian sat beside me taking small notes in a pocket ledger, without ever glancing outside, as if he already knew every bend in the road. By late day, we reached a lonely church on a gravel spur. The county sheriff waited there, leaning against his cruiser, looking drained in the kind of way that comes from nights spent awake with thoughts he couldn't share. He shook the captain's hand and repeated the same phrase 3 times. The valley's been cleared, but his voice cracked on the last word. When pressed, he said most families took relocation without trouble, though a few held on longer than they should have. He wouldn't say why they lingered, only muttered that people who belonged to this land trusted it more than they trusted strangers. In the church basement, we spread maps across folding tables, while the sheriff pointed out the narrow choke leading into Hell Gap. Storms sometimes trapped the place for days, he told us, flat and resigned, and the old mine had caused problems for years. What kind of problems? He pretended not to hear the question. When we left the church, the sun dipped low, fog rising in slow sheets across the valley below. We walked the final mile on foot, boots slipping on wet leaves, rifles held low. The civilian whispered to the captain more than once, soft words I couldn't fully catch. Confirm emptiness, verify sites, remove nothing. The instructions scraped at me like small stones in my boot. Our first checkpoint was an old gatehouse overlooking the entry road. Fresh boards covered its windows, but the air inside smelled of new-cut pine overlaying something sour-sweet, like wet foliage heated under a metal hood. I tried to ignore it, but the smell clung deep in the back of my throat. We moved farther into the valley as darkness thickened. A single house stood by the road, lit by a lone porch lamp, burning steady through the rising fog. Inside, we found dinner plates on a table, a pot cooling on the stove, and a radio with the cord ripped from the wall. No footprints leading out, no sign of departure. The same strange sweetness hung in the air, stronger now. The captain marked the structure unconfirmed empty, though nothing about it felt empty. As we continued, the valley seemed to fold around us, ridges narrowing, then spreading again in ways that defied the maps. My pace count matched the terrain until we reached a bend in the creek where the numbers suddenly stretched, the ground longer than the chart claimed. I checked again, still long. By full dark, we reached the abandoned company town. Storefronts collapsed inward, a tipple leaning like a broken joint. Nothing moved, no lights, but deep in the hollow, I felt a low pressure beneath the wind, almost like breath drawn slow and long. We set our first hide on a ridge overlooking the valley floor. As the captain wrote in his log and the civilians scanned the dark with field glasses, that faint vibration returned, rushing the edge of hearing, steady as bone-deep memory. I logged the day's distances, though none of them made sense. Something told me we would need them before the week was done. The valley looked washed in pale color when morning finally pressed through the fog, and as we descended from the ridge, the air carried that same faint vibration that had followed us since our arrival. Subtle, patient, as though it waited for us to take each step before answering with one of its own. The old company town lay ahead in a shrunken hush, wooden fronts sagging inward, sun-faded letters peeling across cracked boards, dust filmed over windows that hadn't seen breath or movement in months. Yet the deeper we walked into the narrow lanes, the more we found small signs that someone had passed through just hours before. A lantern burned low beside a crate, its wick trimmed clean. A rolled blueprint rested on a stoop before ending abruptly at a boarded doorway, as if whoever carried it had stepped directly into solid planks without pausing to open the entrance. And the engineer crouched, running a gloved hand across the prints in the dust, saying they were fresh, no more than a day old, made by boots that belonged to someone who knew these paths well. The captain radioed the outer post to ask if any state workers had returned since the evacuation, but the answer came sharp and certain. No one had entered after the sheriff closed the road. We continued through the square, moving house to house, and although most rooms sat silent, each one held remnants of recent life, laundry sagging on a line behind a porch, a kettle left to cool on a stove, a child's jacket folded neatly across the back of a wooden chair. None of it looked panicked or abandoned in haste. It looked like families had stepped away fully intending to return. In the last small home along the row, chalk symbols curled across the doorframe, rough arcs, half-shapes, marks that reminded me of maps drawn by someone who did not trust paper. The civilians studied them without a word, before asking the captain to photograph a wall inside the kitchen where someone had sketched a great uneven circle with jagged lines spreading outward like spokes in the shape of the valley. Beside those spokes were tiny notches. They aligned closely with the wire routes stamped on our own map. The chalk had settled into the plaster long before our arrival, dust clinging to each line with a weight that made my stomach tighten. The captain ordered the engineer to cover the drawings with a coat of beige paint, while the civilians slipped a final picture into his collection. No explanation, no reason. We left the town behind and crossed the creek at a narrow crook of stone, where cold water slid against our boots like it crawled from somewhere deeper than the mountain runoff. The bed didn't match the map either. Its curve sharper, the altitude off, the distance stretched, and even the engineer's altimeter readings wavered, unable to settle on numbers that should have been straightforward. A strange chill radiated upward from the current, seeping into my calves even through thick rubber. By mid-morning, we reached the mine's old entrance where the tipple leaned like tired bones over rusted rails. The smell drifted heavier here, a sweet metallic note that curled in the air despite the crisp breeze. The civilian refused entry for now, insisting he needed a perimeter check completed before we stepped deeper. As we circled the site, dead grass crunched under our boots, the faint vibration rising strong enough that I felt it across my jaw. The signals man adjusted his radio. Frowning, his static rose and dipped in a way that felt patterned, almost like breath drawn to a thin pipe. By evening, we returned to the ridge above the gorge where darkness seemed to gather faster than usual, as if the shadows ran ahead of the sunset. We set another hide overlooking the valley floor, the hum no longer fading during the quiet moments but lingering beneath each breath. I wrote in my notebook by dim red light, each number from my pace count misaligned with the map. Even when I recounted them twice, nothing added up. The engineer checked his own figures, muttering about outdated prints while glancing uneasily at the narrow throat of the gorge. When night finally swallowed the valley, flickers of movement stirred along the far slope. Not animals, not lanterns, just shapes shifting between trees with purposeful steps, turning in unison where the hillside curved. The captain said they were deer. I said nothing. The shadows moved too cleanly, too controlled, gliding with the smooth intent of something that knew the valley better than we did. At some point in the night, the ridge trembled beneath us, not like a quake, not violent, but slow and steady, passing through the stone like a prolonged exhale. The hum swelled, then eased back into its thin whisper. The signals man whispered that the radio hiss had begun pulsing in a new rhythm. The captain told him to stop talking and get some rest. When dawn pushed through again, we began the next phase of our survey, marking places where engineers would later force controlled slides. It seemed routine enough on paper: measure choke points, walk the creek line, verify slopes, but the deeper we moved, the more the land shifted beneath our stride. My count stretched longer than it should have along the water's edge, the creek bending in tight, unnatural curves. That hum lingered in the background like a far-off note or someone forgot to shut down. When we reached the first pass, the engineer laid tape where charges would later nestle into rock. He rechecked the soil firmness twice, uneasy at how damp patches sat beside dry ones regardless of sunlight. But we pushed on, and soon we found signs of others: a warm fire pit under a low overhang, a folded blanket tucked into a crevice, canned food hidden behind brush, all recent, none disturbed. The captain wanted to hail out, but the civilian shook his head sharply, insisting silence. That man's authority outweighed anyone's rank in the valley, though no one admitted it aloud. Near midday, we discovered a raccoon lying under a maple, hair thinned, eyes clouded, body cold but uninjured. The engineer checked for disease but found nothing familiar. We buried it quietly and moved on. Higher up the ridge, the ground shifted again under my stride, soft in one step, hard the next, numbers drifting impossibly far from the map's recorded distances. From the saddle, we spotted the old rail yard below. Dust lined the rails, but footprints patterned the surface in a straight line leading directly beneath a boxcar's shadow. No prints led away. Before we could climb down and inspect the car, the captain radioed us back to town. Something else had appeared. When we arrived, he stood in a farmhouse staring at yet another chalk map etched across a wall. Same circle, same sweeping arcs, only now clustered marks concentrated near the gorge where our heaviest charges would soon rest. The civilian photographed the wall without expression before the engineer painted it over. As dusk thickened, we set our hide along a ridge shelf, the hum tightening in the air like a water pole taut. Shadows shifted again across the far slope. Same routes, same deliberate pace, never closer, never farther, as if patrolling paths too old to forget. When darkness settled fully, a cold tremor rolled beneath us, drawing dust from the frame of the shelf. My pencil shifted slightly as the vibration faded. And lying there, staring into the void of Hell Gap, I felt the first clear truth settle in my bones. We weren't marking a valley to keep people out. We were preparing a seal meant to keep something in. The rusted rails of the old yard glimmered under the thinning clouds when we finally descended from the ridge, and as we moved between the warped sleepers, the quiet there felt heavier than the rest of the valley, as if sound itself hesitated before crossing the tracks. Dust coated the metal in a thick, undisturbed layer, yet through that muted film ran a clean line of footprints, single file, heel to toe, stretching dead center down the track, until they vanished beneath the shadow of an abandoned boxcar. No return prints, no stray steps, no scuffs around the edges. Whoever walked there either stepped into the darkness and stayed there, or disappeared in a way that made the back of my throat tighten. We didn't investigate then. The captain called us over the radio, his voice clipped and sharp, ordering us back to the farmhouse on the far road. Something else had surfaced. By the time we reached him, he stood motionless in a narrow kitchen, staring at another chalk map that sprawled across the wall in thick, jagged lines. It was almost identical to the one in the townhouse. The same wide circle, the same long arc stretching across the plaster, but this version held an unsettling addition. Small clustered marks gathered near the gorge, lining up precisely with the locations where we'd planned the heaviest charges. The civilian's jaw tightened, though he kept his expression flat as he snapped photos. The captain signaled the engineer to cover the drawing. The civilian waited until the paint tin opened before taking one last picture and stepping back, silent as always, as if verifying some theory he wasn't ready to name. We left the house without speaking and made for the overlook as shadows lengthened across the valley. The air cooled quickly, the wind slipping through the trees like thin fingers tapping on our sleeves. That familiar sweet metallic scent drifted heavier with every step. The hum we had grown used to, always faint, always hiding beneath the valley's quiet, rose and dipped now in a steadier rhythm, pulsing faintly against my ears like a breath drawn through a narrow throat. When we reached the ridge, we set a new hide among scattered rocks, careful to keep our profiles low. The signals man hunched over his radio again, rolling through frequencies, eyebrows cinched in a deep, unsettled crease. He said the background hiss had changed. It no longer drifted randomly in soft static waves. Now it pulsed, rising and falling in intervals too steady to be coincidence. For a long moment, he held the speaker to his ear, unmoving, then slowly lowered it and shook his head. When I asked what he heard, he just muttered, "It's not empty down there," and left it at that. As night bled through the trees, the far slopes stirred with movement again. Not shapes we could name, not the random shifting of deer or the jittery twitch of foxes, but dark silhouettes gliding along the tree line with a pace too smooth and synchronized for wildlife. They followed the hillside's curve in a long, silent procession, weaving through the pines as though traveling pathways laid long before the town was built. The captain insisted it was just animals, shadows playing tricks, anything that fit the world we knew. The problem was that none of us truly believed him. We watched those shapes move with a quiet dread that none dared voice. Later, while I scribbled notes by the faint glow of a filtered lamp, the ridge shuddered beneath me in a low, steady rumble. Not enough to call it a quake, not sharp enough to be collapse. Just a drawn-out tremor that seeped through the soil like a long breath, exhaled from somewhere deep beneath the valley floor. When it passed, the hum softened again but didn't vanish, lingering in the air with a patience that felt almost sentient. I found myself staring across the dark toward the narrow mouth of the gorge, where moonlight pooled in strange bends along the water, turning its twisting path into something sharper, more deliberate than any river should naturally carve. The longer I looked, the more certain I became that Hell Gap wasn't just a neglected stretch of land. It was something shaped, guided, as if molded by unseen hands carrying out a purpose we hadn't been told about. We rose before the sun fully crested the peaks, the fog curling around our boots in low sliding waves. The captain wanted a full sweep of the upper hollows. The sheriff had mentioned a few families refusing relocation, and the captain, still holding firmly to the line that no one would be sealed inside this valley, refused to proceed with charges until he knew those residents were accounted for. The civilian disagreed at first, speaking quietly to him in a tone that bordered on warning, but the captain stood his ground. In the end, the civilian nodded, conceding with the kind of expression that suggested he was merely shifting tactics rather than agreeing. Our team split at the bend in the creek. My group climbed the right-hand slope, weaving through steep patches of oak and dense laurel. The ground felt off again. Soft where it should have been hard, hollow where it should have been solid, the soil behaving like something had settled or shifted beneath it. My stride count stretched impossibly long. The map said the climb should measure a few hundred feet. My notes insisted we had covered twice that. The numbers were impossible, yet they demanded to be written. Near a narrow stream, we found the first sign of recent habitation, a camp tucked under a rock lip, quilts hanging to dry, canned goods stacked with a deliberate order that suggested the owners planned to return. No signs of fear. No signs of a rushed flight. It was as if they stepped away momentarily, with some quiet intention guiding them deeper into the hills. Beside the camp hung a strange object, a twisted bundle of nail, wire, and bone, knotted into a shape I couldn't name and didn't want to understand. It faced the valley, not the stream. The civilian inspected it for a long moment before telling the captain that the families were acting on old beliefs, though he declined to explain what that meant. We continued upward, finding more traces, a half-cleared path through thorn brush, a strip of torn cloth caught on a branch, footprints circling a shallow basin. Each sign felt recent, deliberate, methodical. The valley did not feel abandoned. It felt busy in a quiet, hidden way. The clouds thickened by afternoon, darkening the light. The shadows along the opposite ridge shifted again, gliding through the pines in their steady, unbreakable line. We ignored them as best we could. Then, as we were checking a set of collapsed sheds near a narrow gully, a shot cracked through the air, close enough to split bark from the trunk beside me. We dropped instantly. The captain scanned the ridge, expecting a fleeing figure, but none appeared. The signalsman tried to call out, but the channel remained dead, static pulsing faintly in its now familiar rhythm. We climbed toward the shot's origin point, rifles raised, steps sharp and spread. When we got there, nothing waited. No prints, no shell casing, no clear vantage from which anyone could have fired. The angle didn't make sense. The shot had come from a height the ground did not offer. We regrouped at dusk near the gorge, unsettled and silent. The civilian looked tense, anxious in a way that broke through his usual composure. He told the captain that higher command wanted confirmation of all survey markings. The timeline had accelerated. They wanted the valley sealed sooner than planned. The captain didn't hide his anger this time, insisting civilians were still unaccounted for. But the civilian leaned close, voice low and steady, telling him the operation wasn't about risk, it was about containment. That night, as darkness pooled across the valley floor, the shapes on the far ridge resumed their movement, silent and steady along their invisible paths. The hum tightened in the air again, brushing the edge of thought more than sound. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. Lying in my hide, listening to the slow pulse beneath the quiet, I wrote my notes with a growing certainty that something inside Hell Gap wasn't merely alive. It was aware, and it had begun to take notice of us. The storm reached us before dawn, rolling out of the mountains in a dense curtain that lashed the ridge with cold sheets of rain, and as we packed our gear under the trembling branches, the downpour carried that same faint metallic sweetness we'd smelled since the first night. Stronger now, thick enough that it felt like it clung to the inside of the throat. The creek below roared louder than it should have for such a narrow channel, its voice rising through the trees like distant movement pacing the valley floor. We descended cautiously, boots sliding on mud-slick rocks, every step accompanied by that low, steady hum threading beneath the storm's noise, like a quiet reminder that the valley hadn't forgotten us. The captain wanted to inspect erosion points before the engineers arrived. Any shift in the terrain could jeopardize the sealing plan. When we reached a shallow crossing marked on the map as barely ankle deep, I stepped forward with careful confidence, only for my leg to plunge to the thigh in water far colder than mountain runoff should ever be. It felt like breaking the surface of a hidden cavern pool, sharp and bottomless for a heartbeat. I shoved myself backward as the current dragged at my boot, and the engineer hurried to test the depth. His stick touched rock in the correct place on the next step, but not where I had nearly been pulled under. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The land was shifting beneath us in ways none of us understood. Minutes later, we found tire tracks etched into the mud, deep, fresh, unmistakable, leading down a service path toward the mine. The captain radioed the perimeter post, his voice tense. The reply came back immediate. No vehicle had passed them. Yet something heavy had rolled through this valley after the storm began. We followed the tracks until they reached a patch of stone where the mud thinned. They continued another few feet before stopping abruptly, not turning, not swerving, simply ceasing, as though the vehicle had rolled into open air and vanished. The clearing around the mine looked exactly as we'd left it earlier, rails leaning, timbers sagging, beams held like tired joints. But the air carried that strong sweetness again, and the hum deepened as we approached the entrance, resonating inside my chest like I'd swallowed a tuning fork. Against the captain's warning, the signalsman tested his radio. The static rose into a series of faint, stretched pulses, almost like syllables whispered through metal. The civilian insisted we go only a few steps inside. Even those first yards told us something lived in the dark beyond rust and rot. The walls held rusted brackets older than the mine's modern history, and the engineer brushed away grime to reveal hand-scratched words. Phase 3 successful. Breach. The last word struck all of us with a weight we didn't name aloud. Farther in, the hum thickened into a layered pressure that made my ribs tighten with each breath. The civilian placed a device on the ground, a flat box with a wired probe, and watched the small needle jerk in precise rhythms that matched the sound in the air. He didn't explain what he saw. He simply collected the device, turned, and told us to withdraw. As we stepped back into the rain, the storm slackened into a cold mist drifting from the mine like the exhale of something waking. Fog rolled through the rails with an unnatural slowness. Fog rolled through the rails with an unnatural slowness. Fog rolled through the rails with an unnatural slowness. No one was attained to the floor, and the sound was loud. The sound was loud. We retreated up the ridge without speaking, every one of us glancing over our shoulders as though expecting the fog to rise behind us like a hand reaching from the dark. When we reached the hide, the captain tried the radio again, this time calling the outer observation post. No answer. He tried twice more, voice tightening with each attempt. Still nothing. We moved toward the post in a wide search line. Rain muffled the forest into a damp, hushed world where even our footsteps felt too loud. According to the map, the distance should have taken an hour. It stretched far longer. My stride count inflated to impossible numbers. The engineer's watch had lost more minutes. The signalsman's face grew pale with each failed frequency check. When we reached the observation post, the scene looked undisturbed at first glance. Bedrolls neatly rolled, small fire pit cold but intact. Then we saw the rifles. 2 weapons leaned perfectly against a tree, barrels downward, positioned with the care of men preparing equipment for inspection rather than abandoning it in haste. Their helmets rested beside them. No sign of struggle, no prints in the soft earth. No evidence they'd packed up and walked away, just absence. The captain called their names, voice low but steady. The forest answered only with a shifting breeze carrying that strange, warm metal scent. We spread out to search. Nothing. It was as though the earth itself had swallowed their trail. The civilian stood motionless, then wrote something in his ledger and told the captain the men would be listed as lost in terrain. The captain's jaw clenched so hard his teeth clicked, but he didn't argue. The civilian's authority hung heavy over the ridge, impossible to fight. We returned to the hide with a silence thick enough to drag at the lungs. The captain announced he intended to request immediate extraction and halt the sealing up until the missing men were found. The civilian raised a radio we hadn't heard him use before, sleek, compact, coming faintly, and received a short, sharp reply. Whatever command told in over that channel cut through the captain's authority instantly. We were to continue, no pause. No search, no adjustment. The valley would be sealed. The captain turned away, frustration burning through his restraint, and ordered us to resume marking the next blast sites. As we moved across the ridges, the terrain twisted again. Distances stretched. Shadows leaned at angles that didn't belong to the time of day. Every shift of wind carried that thin vibration, as though something beneath the valley was probing the edges of our senses. When we reached the next placement zone, a wide rock shelf overlooking the gorge, the engineer's measurements refused to match the shape under our boots. The numbers aligned perfectly with the blueprint, yet the land felt broader, heavier, as though it had grown during the night. He checked again and again, same readings, same longness. The signalsman stood still, radio pressed to his chest, saying the background hiss now pulsed softly, steadily, almost like a heartbeat mirrored through static. And below us, the dark throat of the gorge exhaled a faint draft warmer than the surrounding air, carrying that scent of wet leaves and warm metal that had become the valley's quiet signature. We continued our work, but every one of us felt it, the valley shifting, leaning, tightening around us, as if preparing for something we were too late to understand. The engineer checked his measurements again, jaw tightening each time the numbers lined up perfectly on paper, but felt utterly wrong beneath his boots. And as he worked, the signals man stood rigid beside him, staring at his radio like it was breathing. The static rose and fell in soft, steady rhythms, quieter now but disturbingly deliberate, as if something in the valley had matched its tone to the tempo of a living thing. Down the slope, the gorge crouched in shadow, its narrow walls pulsing with faint drafts of warm air that carried the same metallic sweetness we'd smelled since the first night, a scent that seemed to thicken whenever the wind shifted toward us. I found myself staring at the creek as it carved through the narrow throat, its bends sharper than before, like the water followed contours that hadn't existed days earlier. The captain stood beside me, silent, his eyes narrowed toward the gorge as if watching it breathe. He didn't say it aloud, but I knew he felt it too. The valley wasn't settling, it was tightening, closing itself, as though preparing for the engineers we were about to lead inside. Night came early, dragging a dimness that seeped through the ridgelines before the sun had fully dropped. Once darkness settled, the shapes on the far slope emerged again, silent silhouettes gliding along the tree line in their familiar, unbroken procession. They did not falter. They did not waver. They simply continued their steady path as though performing a ritual older than the valley's roads or the mine's rotted beams. None of us raised rifles or even called them out. The longer we watched them move, the clearer it became that whatever those shapes were, they didn't belong to any world we could claim to understand. The hum grew stronger that night, threading through the darkness like a thin wire tightened to the breaking point. When a long tremor slid beneath the ridge, my pack shifted slightly on its own, rolling just enough to set my nerves on edge. The vibration faded, but the memory of it clung stubbornly to the back of my mind. The signals man whispered that the radio pattern felt like controlled breathing now, slow inhales and steady exhales through static, but the captain just told him to keep scanning and conserve power. By dawn, a pale mist blanketed the valley, drifting low along the ground like it wanted to hide the land from daylight. The captain gathered us near the creek and said he wouldn't close this valley with two of his men still missing. The civilian argued, voice low, saying our priority was the sealing plan and that the terrain was becoming unstable. But the captain didn't waver. He simply adjusted his rifle strap and told the civilian he'd lead the sweep himself if necessary. For a moment, I thought the civilian would fight him harder, but instead he gave a slow, measured nod, the expression of someone who understood resistance was pointless. For now, we split into two teams and moved toward the gorge. My team took the right-hand ridge, scrambling over loose stone and fallen trunks slick with mist. The hum pressed against the air in a constant, throbbing presence now, no longer subtle, no longer hiding beneath the valley's quiet. It felt like stepping into the deep end of a pool where pressure surrounds you from every angle. Near a mossy outcrop, we found the first sign of the missing men, a canteen resting atop a cairn-like mound of rocks, placed gently, almost reverently. No mud on it, no scratches, like someone had wiped it clean before leaving it for us to find. The captain's face shifted when he lifted it, but he said nothing, only handed it to me to record its exact position. The warm metal scent lingered heavy around the area, drifting in slow pulses as if rising from the stone. We pressed deeper along the ridge. My stride count stretched again, doubling distances that should have taken minutes to cross. The engineer's altimeter wavered between impossible readings, finally freezing mid-measurement. The shadows on the opposite hillside moved again in their ancient procession, gliding through the trees with the same steady pace, never deviating, never changing their path. The captain watched them longer this time, jaw locked tight, then turned away as though admitting defeat to something he couldn't name. By mid-afternoon, we reached the gorge's narrow choke. Wind funneled through the stone walls in tight, spiraling currents. The creek below twisted like it followed a living will. The smell grew heavier, the hum tightening into a high, ghostly vibration that seemed to resonate through bone rather than air. The engineer said sealing the gap would take more explosives than we carried, but the civilian insisted this was the valley's primary breach point and had to be closed first. We moved across a fallen log bridging two stone shelves. The ground trembled beneath us, soft at first, then harder, a rolling shudder that made dust drift from the gorge walls. A deep crack echoed from above as a slab of rock peeled away in slow motion, sliding downward before smashing into the creek bed with a roar that drowned the valley's hum for only a moment. We sprinted toward a narrow ledge where the captain believed the missing men might have sheltered. When we reached the shallow cave formed by the collapse, we found them, alive, breathing, kneeling motionless in the dim, their eyes glassy with a strange, tranquil focus. They didn't speak. They didn't flinch when we touched them. It was as though whatever held them had loosened just enough to let them stand, but not enough to let them fully return. As we led them out, the walls trembled again, and the hum rose into a thin, almost curious tone. The engineer's altimeter froze completely. The signalsman whispered the radio's breathing pattern had slowed, stretching the seconds unnaturally. But the moment we passed a sharp bend in the gorge, everything shifted. The hum dropped back to a steady vibration. The missing men blinked more often, their steps steadier. Something released its hold. When we reached our ridge camp, the civilian was already waiting, radio in hand. He gave a clipped report to whatever command answered him, then turned to us with a solemn expression. The valley would be sealed immediately. No more searches. No more delays. The captain didn't argue, not because he agreed, but because he finally understood something none of us wanted to admit. Whatever lived in Hell Gap wasn't finished, and every hour we remained only gave it more room to breathe. The captain stood at the ridge edge for a long time after the civilian delivered the final order. The rescued men resting behind us with that strange, dazed calm still lingering in their eyes. And even though the captain didn't say a word, every one of us felt the weight settle over the valley like a verdict finally spoken aloud. The engineers arrived at sunrise, 3 trucks grinding their way up the narrow road, engines laboring, gears whining, carrying crates of shaped charges, cutting equipment, reinforced wire spools, and tools built for burying mountains. Mist peeled back in slow curls as they stepped out, their boots sinking into soft earth that seemed to shift beneath them, like something alive and listening. A few of them paused instinctively, staring toward the gorge with unsettled expressions, sensing the same low vibration in the air that had followed us for days. The captain briefed them with a voice that sounded steady but tired, going over the blast sites we had marked, the choke points, the ridges that needed collapsing. The civilian hovered close, watching every word with the kind of scrutiny that came from someone guarding a truth he'd never share with any of us. The engineers nodded along, but the looks they exchanged weren't the casual glances of seasoned men. They were uneasy, tightened around the edges, wary of a place that breathed wrong. We moved first toward the choke point along the ridge line. With each step, the hum rose and fell in soft, rhythmic intervals, like something beneath the soil was inhaling and exhaling in time with the wind. The engineers drilled into the rock, while our own team confirmed distances. Dust drifted in slow spirals each time a drill bit bit into stone. I walked the perimeter again, counting strides, and once more the land stretched beneath my boots, numbers aligning with yesterday's tape marks, yet feeling far wider, as if the valley were shifting its shape the moment we looked away. I recorded the figures anyway, though none of them made sense outside the valley's logic. We then moved toward the second site by the creek bend. The smell thickened as we approached. Wet leaves, warm nettle, and something faintly sweet that clung to the tongue like residue from another place entirely. One of the engineers rubbed his eyes and said he must have caught exhaust from a motor, but none of the equipment was running. The captain scanned the hollows above us, hoping for a glimpse of the missing pair, even though we all knew the search had been called off. The slopes remained still, shadows swaying only with the wind. Yet every shift of light made those shadows look like they nearly stepped into motion. By mid-afternoon, we reached the gorge, the heart of the sealing plan. The narrow throat sat bathed in a dim, unnatural twilight, even though the sky above remained clear. The civilian walked ahead, tracing invisible lines through the air with his eyes, as if following instructions written on the valley itself. The engineers hauled crates of charges to the stone walls, their movements cautious but brisk. As drills screamed against rock, the hum sharpened, tightening into a thin thread that vibrated straight through bone. My radio hissed with stretched pulses, too slow for interference, too rhythmically arranged to be random. The signals man muttered under his breath that the valley felt like it was listening. I couldn't disagree. When the first tremor hit, the drills stopped instantly. Dust rained from the gorge walls. A low groan rolled through the stone like a massive animal shifting in its sleep. The captain ordered everyone to freeze. The tremor passed, but the air didn't lighten. It felt like the valley was waiting to see what we would do next. After a tense minute, the civilian gave the order to continue. Charges were placed along the tightest bends, deck cord coiled across the stone like pale serpents waiting for breath. The hum deepened into a low tone that buzzed at the base of my skull. The civilian produced another one of his strange devices, a small box with a quivering needle, and pressed its probe against the rock. The needle twitched in perfect time with the vibration in the air. He said nothing, only wrote a note and moved on, leaving the rest of us with an unease that settled like cold water beneath the whips. We climbed higher to set the final series of explosive packets along the upper ridge. Shadows drifted across the opposite slope, moving in their slow, deliberate line as they had every night. Except now, under daylight, they seemed sharper, darker, more defined, though still too far to identify. The captain's face went still as he watched them. Finally acknowledging their presence with a quiet question, he asked only me, "How long?" I told him they had walked every night since our arrival. His expression tightened, but he said nothing more. By the time we completed the placements, the air had grown colder, the light dimmer, though the sun wasn't yet close to setting. The hum rose into a long, steady tone, not loud, but unmistakably intentional, like a warning whispered through stone. The captain turned sharply toward us. "We move now," he said. No one questioned him. Even the engineers felt the shift in the valley's breathing. We retreated along the ridge as the first deep cracks echoed from the gorge. The engineer reached the detonation point and linked the final firing line. The civilian radioed a short confirmation, and in the next heartbeat, the valley erupted with a sequence of low, rolling blasts that shook the ground beneath us. Stone walls folded inward. Entire slabs of the gorge collapsed with a roar that swallowed the hum for a single powerful moment, then replaced it with a heavy, rumbling silence as the creek bent in a new direction, now forced beneath the collapsed debris. Dust choked the air. Birds scattered from treetops in frantic arcs. The gorge sealed itself under a mountain of shattered rock and ancient soil, a wall so dense and complete it looked almost primordial. The valley exhaled one final trembling sigh, and then the hum, ever present, ever waiting, slipped into silence so sudden it left my ears ringing with the memory of it. The sealing was done. But every one of us felt the same truth, settling across our shoulders as the dust began to fall. Whatever the valley had held back for decades wasn't gone. It was nearly buried, waiting. When the dust finally thinned enough for us to see, the valley lay reshaped beneath a pale, unsettled light, quiet not in the peaceful sense, but in that suffocating way a room feels after something enormous has just left it behind. The captain walked ahead without speaking, boots sinking into loose rubble as he approached what remained of the mine. The tipple jutted from the collapse like a snapped bone, one broken rib of the structure that had once served as the valley's hollowed heart. He stared at it for a long, silent stretch, the weight of every lost answer settling behind his eyes, then turned away, as though acknowledging that whatever truth slept under that rock was no longer ours to confront. The civilian stood off to the side, radio pressed to his mouth, issuing a calm report, but he kept glancing toward the ridgelines, scanning for movement that never came. And though his voice stayed even, I caught the flicker of unease in his eyes. The creek, once bending through the gorge in sharp, unnatural twists, flowed now along a redirected path, guided by the weight of thousands of tons of fallen stone. Even with the gorge sealed, the faint metallic tang hung in the air, softer now, but unmistakable, drifting like a final reminder of what the valley had carried beneath its skin. We guided the engineers toward the exit route, moving past the empty houses and leaning storefronts of the company town. The place felt different now, not alive, not dead, but paused, as though the collapse had frozen something mid-breath. Doors that had been shut days earlier now hung open. Curtains shifted gently in windows where the glass had long since broken. It was as though the valley itself adjusted its posture after the sealing, settling into a new shape it had been waiting to reclaim. At the edge of town, we passed the remains of the paths cleared by the families who'd refused relocation. Fresh footprints near hollows, fire pits still warm beneath damp ash, a kettle cooling beside a stump. The captain paused at each sign, uneasy, wanting to double back and sweep the hills once more. But the civilian cut him off with a quiet finality. The valley was now federal land under emergency designation, and no one, not the families, not wandering surveyors, not even us, would be allowed inside again. Fences would rise within days. Patrols would follow. Hell Gap was no longer a place on a map. It was a sealed wound. As we climbed out, I looked back one last time. Mist drifted through the valley in slow, looting currents. The shadows along the far slope, those silent gliding shapes that had haunted our nights, were gone now. Whether the collapse forced them deeper into the land or erased their paths entirely, I couldn't say. The valley appeared still, almost content in its new quiet. But the silence didn't feel like closure. It felt like a heavy pause, a held breath waiting beneath the sealed stone. At the final ridge, the captain stopped and held out his hand for my notebook. I passed it to him, already knowing he wouldn't keep the real version. He flipped through the pages, every impossible measurement, every warped stride count, every shifting distance, and after a moment he handed it back, telling me to keep the original for myself. "The official copy will look different," he said quietly. "Cleaner." I understood what he meant. Our numbers didn't fit the terrain the government needed to describe. The valley we walked would become a different valley on paper. One they could explain, one they could bury without raising questions. The moment we stepped past the ridgeline, the hum vanished entirely. Not faded, vanished. It left a hollow absence in its place, like someone had lifted a weight from my ears I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. I felt lighter and heavier all at once. At the guard post, the engineers loaded their gear and drove off in tight, silent lines. The civilian climbed into a separate vehicle without so much as a nod. The captain spoke with the post commander in hushed tones before turning back to us. The lines in his face cut deeper than they'd been a week earlier. We were finished here. We would return to Fort Knox, file our reports exactly as instructed, and speak no more of the valley. The ride back stretched longer than it should have, each mile feeling like a slow drift out of a dream that had never belonged to us. The rescued men slept the whole way, their faces calm in a way that made the hair rise on my arms. They had returned, yes, but some part of them still looked like it listened to sounds the rest of us didn't hear. When we reached the post, officers took our gear, maps, and notes. The civilian handed off his case and slipped away into a restricted building without a word. The debrief they gave us barely lasted an hour. They called the collapse a necessary geological intervention, said the valley posed long-term risk, insisted the evacuation had gone smoothly. Our reports were rewritten on the spot, chalk maps omitted, missing men reframed, distances corrected, radio interference attributed to weather. Everything that made Hell Gap what it truly was dissolved under administrative ink. Later that night, I sat alone and pulled out my real notebook, the one that held the impossible numbers, the bending timelines, the ground that shifted beneath our feet. I considered returning someday, if only to see the land again. But each time that thought formed, I remembered the cave, the heavy breath of warm metal in the air, the way the gorge hummed like a living throat, and the shadows that walked the ridgelines, as if the valley itself had carved them into being. A week later, a small newspaper clipping mentioned a landslide in eastern Kentucky. No names, no dates, just a short paragraph about families relocated for their safety and a valley restricted for environmental stabilization. After that, Hell Gap vanished from public record. Maps redrew their lines, roads diverted. The valley became nothing more than a blank stretch of green federal land, closed indefinitely. Years passed, other missions came and went. But sometimes, on cold nights when the wind slides across the trees in long, even breaths, I feel that vibration again, thin, familiar, patient, and I understand a truth deeper than any report we signed. We did not seal Hell Gap because it was failing. We sealed it because it was listening, and whatever memory lived under that gorge never stopped paying attention. That was the full account of the U.S. Recon team sent to seal off Hell Gap back in 1964. A valley the government erased, a place the maps forgot, and a memory I've carried longer than I care to admit. If stories like this keep you up at night the same way they keep me talking, then do me one favor before you head out. Hit that subscribe button, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and share this video with someone who thinks they've heard every classified tale out there. This is Captain Rebel. Thanks for sticking with me through the shadows. Stay sharp, stay safe, and keep listening to what the land doesn't want to say out loud.